Greetings, creative writing students. My name is Daniel Clark, and this is my poetry presentation. And the poet I chose was Natasha Trethewey. And one thing to note before delving into her poetry is that most of her poems are strongly influenced by her upbringing, especially the upbringing of her parents. Her parents led an interracial marriage, or had an interracial marriage. That is to simply say that her dad was white and her mother was black, and they married, and a lot of that influenced the idea of her being mixed. A mixed race influenced a lot of her poetry. And even just delving right into it, the Enlightenment, for instance, her poem just starts out talking about Thomas Jefferson's place at Monticello, and describing a portrait of him with two colors, a white gleaming down on him, and then also a sort of a dark backdrop, which is interesting because it's indicative of the life that Thomas Jefferson led. Yes, he was a white man who despised slavery, yes, but had slaves nonetheless, and was said to have interracial relations with some of those slaves. So it's interesting to note that Jefferson could have had some children of mixed race, which relates to Natasha's upbringing with her father. Even it says she mentions that in relation to her father, the improvement of blacks in body and mind in first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe. And then she says, when I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful memory etched on the mind's eye. And so she's sort of recollecting her past with her father, in that her father's marriage to her mother sort of gave her that mixed race, this sort of dual identity, and that again influences the rest of her poems. And now the next poem, Providence, is a bit different. It describes a historical event, Hurricane Camille in 1969. But one thing to note is that she sort of uses the destruction of the hurricane to sort of relate to the later destruction of her life. What I mean is that she describes the decrepit buildings, the torn up foundations, the torn roofs of the houses, all this destruction that was caused by Hurricane Camille. But what it says is she mentions the next day, our house on its cinder block seemed to float in the flooded yard. No foundation beneath us, nothing I could see tying us to the land. In the water our reflection trembled, disappeared when I bent to touch it. And it's sort of this metaphor that the loss of her home, or the loss of the narrator's home, rather, describes a sort of loss of identity, because oftentimes where we grow up, where our home is, just the concept of a home is tied up so much in our identities. And so once the foundation of our home goes, and there's nothing stable beneath us, we sort of question our identities. And that's one thing I picked up in Providence. Now, coming back to this idea of the mixed race, the third poem I chose is The Flounder. And it sort of describes the narrator is reflecting on an experience with her aunt, where she is essentially immediately called to, race is immediately called to the foreground. And she mentions, you're about as white as your dad. I mean, at surface level, the speaker is simply making a pun as she is protecting the child from the sun when she tells her to put on her hat. And but on a deeper level, it's a type of speech that, you know, calls to mind the historical historical narrative of black and white America. It's this sort of dual race that comes forth, and that's why I think the aunt, or she likens the whole poem to a flounder. It's a fish with a dual identity. One side of the fish is black, and the other side of it is white. The question is, which is she of? And so there seems to be some sort of question of identity here, in that she cannot fully be one, she cannot fully be other. She exists simultaneously as black and white. And so I think it's interesting to note the sort of dual racism, not racism, I'm sorry, the dual race mentality that Natasha Trethewey is exploring. Now, granted, it was a bit tough to delve into this stuff because I'm terrible at poetry, but I felt like the more I read it, I was able to, you know, sort of glean sort of the racial undertones of the whole thing, and have those things come to light. So I hope you guys learned something from my presentation. I know I have from yours. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because again, poetry is not my strong suit, not my forte. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.